On the day my grandfather's will was read, my own father burned my $43 million inheritance check. He screamed, "Your white uniform is a joke. It's worthless in the real world." But he didn't know that ash was the kindling for my war. I am Lieutenant Commander Serafina Volkov, United States Navy, 38 years old. I stood at a modified parade rest, my spine a column of discipline, deep inside the lion's den. The law offices of Vance and Associates were a silent fortress of wealth perched high above La Jolla Cove, a place where the air smelled of polished mahogany and quiet arrogance. Through the vast windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched out, a canvas of indifferent blue. But inside this conference room, the atmosphere was as heavy and charged as the air before a lightning strike. My service dress white uniform, a stark symbol of honor, felt like a foreign object here, an insult to this world of Tom Ford suits and Hermes handbags. It was a world I was born into, but had deliberately escaped. My father, Maximilian Thorne, did not look up from his iPad. His fingers, adorned with a heavy gold ring, swiped across the screen as if my presence were a mere inconvenient smudge on his periphery. He was the CEO of Aegis Dynamics, a titan in the defense contracting world, a man who measured life in stock prices. Across the gleaming table, my sister, Isolde, offered a fleeting cold glance. A nearly invisible smirk played on her lips, a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. She wasn't seeing her sister, she was assessing a competitor who had chosen the wrong weapons for this war. There were no greetings, no welcome home, just a heavy, oppressive silence, a deliberate ostracism more deafening than any shout. I held my position, hands clasped behind my back, betraying nothing of the tightening knot in my stomach. This was their territory. I was here for one reason, a promise to my grandfather. Evelyn Vance, the family's attorney for decades, cleared her throat. The rustle of paper was the only sound. She began to read the last will and testament of Admiral Augustus Gus Volkov. Her voice was a monotone drone, a practiced instrument for delivering news, good or bad, with detached finality. The villa in Coronado went to Isolde. The Admiral's rare collection of naval history books went to Maximilian. Generous, predictable gifts. I felt my shoulders relax fractionally. This would be over soon. Then Evelyn turned a page. Her voice shifted just slightly, a subtle change in cadence that sent a jolt through the stale air. "And to my granddaughter, Lieutenant Commander Serafina Volkov," she read, her voice now holding a quiet, deliberate emphasis. "My sole confidant and my fellow warrior. I leave the entire remainder of my estate. This includes all financial holdings, real estate properties, and, effective immediately, the controlling voting shares of Aegis Dynamics." The silence in the room shattered, not with a sound, but with its sudden, absolute weight. Maximilian's iPad clattered onto the table. The smug mask on Isolde's face cracked, replaced by a raw look of disbelief and fury. The air was sucked out of the room. It was in that vacuum that Evelyn Vance, with a steady hand, slid a cashier's check across the table, $38,246,000. It lay there, a crisp blue rectangle in the center of the vast table, like the still, quiet eye of a hurricane. I knew then, this wasn't a gift, it was a mission, it was a declaration of war. Before I could even process the number, before I could draw a breath, Maximilian moved. He didn't walk, he lunged, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He snatched the check from the table as if it were a venomous snake. His eyes, cold and calculating, just moments before, now burned with a wild, unrestrained rage that I hadn't seen since I told him I was accepting my appointment to the Naval Academy. A reward for abandoning your family to play soldier? He snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl that vibrated with years of resentment. Then he did the unthinkable. He pulled out a gold Zippo lighter, a gaudy gift from a Saudi business partner, and flicked it open. The flame leapt to life, a small malevolent star in the dim corporate light. "Let me show you its real value," he spat, his face contorted. He held the flame to the corner of the check, his hand trembling with fury. "That white uniform is a costume, a pathetic charade. It's worthless in the real world, the one where men make real money." The fire licked at the paper, greedily consuming the numbers, the signatures, my name. The ink blistered and blackened. My grandfather's legacy, his final act of faith in me, was turning to black, brittle ash, fluttering down onto the polished surface of their expensive, hollow world. A sick, hollow feeling churned in my stomach, a physical pain that had nothing to do with the money. It was the brutal, public annihilation of my life's choice, of my service, of my honor. I stood my ground, my training took over. I did not flinch, I did not cry out. My face remained a mask of disciplined calm. I simply watched him, this man who was my father, as he performed his act of ultimate rejection. And I felt the solid, reassuring weight of the second envelope, the one my grandfather had given me, still tucked away in the inner pocket of my uniform jacket. Their game was over. My war had just begun. The black ashes on the mahogany table swirled slightly in the air-conditioned breeze, and a memory, sharp and cold, cut through the shock. It wasn't the first time they had tried to erase me. The first time it was my entire past. I remember returning from my first deployment in the Persian Gulf. 18 months of sand, sea, and the constant, grinding pressure of military law in a combat zone. I was exhausted down to my bones, but I was also filled with a naive excitement to be home, to sleep in my own bed, to feel the cool San Diego air on my skin. I walked into the sprawling Thorne family mansion in Coronado, my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow, empty one. Then I opened the door to my childhood bedroom, or what used to be my bedroom. A cold, metallic feeling washed over me. The room was gone. My bed, the one with the navy blue comforter I'd had since I was 16, was replaced by 2 sterile beige armchairs. My desk, scarred with the history of late-night study sessions for the Naval Academy entrance exams, was gone. In its place stood a glass table holding a single, perfect, and utterly fake orchid. My bookshelves, once overflowing with novels and military history, were empty. My photos, my awards, the small framed flag from my Annapolis graduation, all of it had vanished as if I had never existed. Isolde walked past the open door, a delicate teacup of mint tea in her hand. She paused, taking in the shock on my face, with a small, satisfied smirk. "Don't be so dramatic, Serafina," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's a sitting room now. It's far more useful. After all, it's not like you're ever here to use it." She took a delicate sip of her tea and glided away, leaving me standing in the ghost of my own life. It wasn't just a redecoration, it was an eviction. A quiet, brutal statement that my space, my history in this house, was irrelevant. I was a guest, a transient, a footnote in the grand story of the Thorne family. The memory then shifted, sharpening to a more public humiliation. The last Christmas party I attended at the Coronado Mansion. The house was a glittering spectacle, a scene straight out of a magazine, filled with the scent of pine, roasting turkey, and the quiet hum of wealthy, powerful people making connections. Maximilian stood at the head of the long dining table, a crystal glass of expensive Napa Cabernet Sauvignon in his hand. He looked every bit the corporate king, basking in the glow of his success. "A toast," he began, his voice resonating with authority. "To my daughter, Isolda, who this quarter single-handedly secured a $50 million contract with the Department of Defense. She is the future of Aegis Dynamics." A chorus of "hear, hear," and applause filled the room. Isolda inclined her head graciously, a perfect picture of the successful heiress. Then my father's gaze fell on me. The pride in his eyes vanished, replaced by an expression of tolerant, almost pitying amusement. "And a toast for Serafina as well," he added, as if remembering a minor detail. "She's still serving our country, working for the government, a stable career, I suppose." A few of his business partners chuckled, a low, polite sound that felt like a slap in the face. A stable career. The words hung in the air, cheapening my uniform, my rank, my years of sacrifice. I felt the familiar heat of shame creep up my neck. In their world, a world of ruthless ambition and nine-figure deals, my life of service was a quaint, slightly embarrassing hobby. I was the family's charity case, the oddity they had to explain away at parties. That night, the sting of his words was so sharp, I couldn't bear the false cheer any longer. I slipped out, driving my old Jeep Wrangler not to my empty apartment, but to the one place that felt like a true home port. My grandfather's modest house overlooking the San Diego Bay. The air there was different, clean and salty, free of the suffocating scent of money. Admiral Gus didn't ask what was wrong. He never did. He just wordlessly poured 2 glasses of Bullet bourbon, handed one to me, and sat beside me on his worn wooden porch swing. We watched the distant lights of the naval ships in the harbor, a silent constellation of purpose. "They don't understand honor, Seraph," he finally said, his voice a low, comforting rumble, like a distant engine. "They measure a person's worth in dollars. We measure it in integrity. Don't you ever confuse the two." He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "You know," he continued, "I was listening to a speech by Admiral McRaven the other day, the one about making your bed. He said that if you want to change the world, you can't ever ring the bell." He looked at me, his eyes clear and steady in the twilight. "They're ringing the bell for you, Serafina. They're trying to make you quit. Don't you let them." His words were an anchor in the storm of my self-doubt and resentment. He saw the battle I was in, a battle not fought with guns, but with expectations and quiet cruelties. They would never believe in my path. So why? A small, defiant voice whispered inside me. Why should I ever walk on theirs? How could I build a life so strong, so independent, that I would never have to feel the sting of their judgment again? My grandfather's words echoed in my mind long after I left his porch that night. Don't you ever let them make you ring the bell. And so, my answer to the question of how to build a life they couldn't touch began with an act of complete and total separation. It started with a cramped one-bedroom apartment in North Park, San Diego, a place with old plumbing and thin walls where the constant hum of the I-805 freeway was my lullaby, but it was mine. I used the meager savings from my academy days for the security deposit and first month's rent, my signature on the lease agreement feeling more significant than any I'd put on a military document. My first meal in that empty apartment was a box of Kraft macaroni and cheese and a can of Coors Light, eaten while sitting on the bare floor. The taste of that simple meal was the taste of freedom, a flavor both bitter with loneliness and sweet with defiance. I made a silent vow then and there. I would never take a single dollar from the Thorne family again. Not for an emergency, not for a holiday gift, not even for a cup of coffee. Every dollar I earned would be a brick in the fortress of my independence. Life became a relentless grind. My days were consumed by my duties as a JAG officer, but my evenings and weekends were filled with more work. I took on extra case reviews, poring over dense legal files until my eyes burned. I started tutoring junior officers in military law for $100 a session, spending my Saturdays in the base library instead of at the beach. While Isolde was attending charity galas and flying to Europe on the company jet, my idea of a luxury was a carne asada burrito from a little taqueria in Barrio Logan that I could afford without checking my bank balance first. At Aegis Dynamics, Isolde's ascent to vice president was a carefully orchestrated coronation, paved with my father's money and connections. My own promotions were battles fought in the trenches. I had to earn every single step. My commanding officer, a stern, old-school Navy captain, initially viewed me with suspicion. I could see it in his eyes. He saw the name Thorne and likely assumed I was a spoiled corporate brat playing dress-up. So I took the cases no one else wanted. The messy, complicated ones. I defended a young sailor accused of dereliction of duty, uncovering evidence that proved his innocence against a tide of internal politics. I untangled a complex procurement fraud case that implicated a senior officer. I didn't use my family name. I used my brain, my work ethic, and the unyielding logic of the law. Slowly, I earned my place. The turning point came after I won a particularly nasty court-martial, protecting a young Marine from a wrongful conviction. My captain called me into his office. He didn't smile, he just nodded, his face stern as ever, and said, "Good work, Volkov." That simple, two-word acknowledgement, earned through sheer merit, felt more valuable than any multi-million-dollar contract my sister had ever landed. It was a currency they would never understand, but the path was not without its hardships. There were months when ramen noodles were my staple for a week straight, just to save enough to get the transmission on my old Jeep fixed. Loneliness was a constant companion, especially on holidays, but through it all, I remembered what my grandfather used to quote to me from the Bible, a verse he'd underlined in his personal copy. "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." It wasn't just about religious faith. For him and for me, it was about finding a source of power that came from within, a resilience that no one could take away. And then there were the mysterious deposits. Every few months, especially when things were tight, a small wire transfer of $200 or $300 would appear in my Navy Federal account. The sender description was always the same, from an old friend. I knew without a doubt it was him. My grandfather never called to ask if I needed help. He knew my pride wouldn't let me accept it. Instead, he offered support silently, like a sniper providing cover from a distance, never revealing his position. Those small sums weren't just about the money. They were a lifeline, a quiet reminder that someone, somewhere, was still in my corner, watching over me, believing in the path I had chosen. After leaving the Thorne family's cold, sterile version of reality, there was only one person I could think of, one person who operated on the same frequency of loyalty and blunt honesty that I understood. Rhea Rhino Caldwell. Her law practice wasn't in a gleaming high-rise. It was tucked away in a converted barracks at Liberty Station, a place that still breathed the spirit of the Navy. The historic Spanish colonial revival architecture stood in stark contrast to the modern, soulless glass towers my father favored. Inside, there was no mahogany or leather, just old brick walls, shelves overflowing with legal binders, and the rich, potent smell of coffee, so strong it could probably strip paint. It was the smell of long nights and hard-fought battles. Rhea looked up as I walked in, her short, steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes missing nothing. She was a retired JAG captain, a legend who had stared down admirals and won. She didn't offer condolences or ask a dozen questions. She simply pointed to a worn armchair piled with case files, pushed them onto the floor with a thud, and thrust a steaming mug of black coffee into my hands. "You look like you just walked through hell and back, Commander," she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. "Talk to me." And for the first time, I did. Not as a daughter explaining a family squabble, but as one officer debriefing another. The whole story poured out of me, the cold reception, the reading of the will, the gold Zippo, the ashes fluttering down onto that polished table. I spoke without emotion, my voice steady, relaying the facts as I would in a courtroom. Rhea listened, her gaze never leaving my face, her only reaction an occasional affirming nod. She didn't interrupt with meaningless platitudes like, "I'm so sorry for your loss," or "Everything will be okay." Her silence was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into her own coffee mug as if the answers were written in the black liquid. Then she looked up, her eyes hard as flint. "That son of a bitch," she growled, the words a low rumble of pure, unadulterated anger on my behalf. "He doesn't deserve a daughter like you." That rough, unvarnished statement hit me with the force of a physical blow, but a healing one. It was the most profound validation I had ever received. It was worth more than any praise from my father, any expensive gift from my sister. It was real. In that cluttered office, surrounded by the ghosts of other veterans' legal battles, I no longer felt like an outcast. I was among my own kind, a tribe that understood that honor wasn't a talking point in a corporate mission statement, but a code you lived by and died for. The suffocating loneliness that had been my constant companion for years finally began to recede. That evening, Rhea refused to let me go back to my empty apartment. "No soldier goes back to an empty barracks after a firefight," she declared. She dragged me to Little Italy, to a small, family-owned restaurant called Felipe's Pizza Grotto, a San Diego institution. The owner, a grizzled former Marine with a booming laugh, greeted Rhea with a bear hug. We slid into a red vinyl booth in a back corner, the air thick with the smell of garlic and oregano. We ordered a large pepperoni pizza and a pitcher of local craft beer from Ballast Point. We didn't talk about my family or the will or the money. Instead, we talked about the Navy. We traded stories about impossible commanding officers, about the absurdity of military bureaucracy, about inside jokes that only a service member would understand. For the first time in years, I laughed. Not a polite, strained laugh I used at Thorne family functions, but a deep, genuine laugh that came from the gut. As the evening wore on, the weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter. When Rhea dropped me off at my apartment building later, she didn't offer a hug. She just gave me a firm nod. "Get some rest, Volkov. The war's just started." As I unlocked my door and stepped into the quiet of my own space, I didn't feel the sting of resentment anymore. Instead, There was a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through my chest. I had found my forward operating base, and I knew I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The warmth from that evening with Rhea lingered for a few weeks, a fragile shield against the cold reality of my family. For a brief, foolish moment, I allowed a sliver of hope to take root. Perhaps, I thought, the scorched earth between us could, over time, begin to heal. Perhaps now that the initial shock had passed, they would retreat, and we could exist in a state of distant, armed neutrality. It was a naive hope, the kind only someone starved for peace could harbor. The Thorne family didn't do neutrality. They only understood total victory or total annihilation. And I had just become their primary target. The first volley was fired not with an angry phone call, but with a quiet, bureaucratic denial. I was at a coffee shop in North Park trying to get some work done when I went to pay for my latte. I handed the barista my Navy Federal debit card. She ran it, then handed it back with an apologetic frown. "I'm sorry, it's declined," I frowned, a prickle of annoyance rising. "That's impossible. Can you try it again?" I knew exactly how much was in that account. She tried again. The same result. A cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. This wasn't a glitch. I stepped outside, the bright California sun suddenly feeling harsh and interrogative, and called the credit union's customer service line. After navigating the automated menu and waiting on hold, a polite but distant voice came on the line. I explained the situation. There was a long pause filled with the sound of typing. "Ma'am, I'm showing here Lieutenant Commander Serafina Volkov?" "Yes, that's me." "According to our records, ma'am," the voice said, detached and clinical. "This account was closed 2 weeks ago due to notification of the account holder's passing." The words didn't register at first. Her passing? What does that mean? "It means, ma'am, that the account holder was reported as deceased." Deceased? The word hung in the air, absurd and horrifying. "That's a mistake," I said, my voice tight. "I am the account holder. I am very much alive." The silence on the other end was heavy with bureaucratic indifference. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we received official documentation. There's nothing I can do from my end." A wave of nausea and cold dread washed over me. This was my father's work. It had his fingerprints all over it. An attack that was both devastatingly personal and coldly impersonal, executed through the faceless channels of corporate procedure. Panic, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my early days of training, began to claw at my throat. I ended the call and drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my Jeep, straight to the DMV office in Claremont, a place known for its soul-crushing lines and Kafkaesque logic. I needed to see it in black and white. I needed to see how far they had gone. After an hour that felt like an eternity, standing in a line that snaked through the drab, soulless building, I finally reached the counter. I handed the clerk, a weary-looking woman with tired eyes, my driver's license and military ID. She typed my information into her ancient computer system. She frowned, typed again, then leaned back, her expression shifting from boredom to baffled pity. Ma'am," she began, her voice low, as if she were delivering a medical diagnosis. "There seems to be a flag on your file." "A flag? What kind of flag?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. She looked at me, then back at her screen, then back at me. According to the state of California and the Social Security Administration, this Social Security number belongs to an individual who was declared legally dead 2 weeks ago. I stared at her, the blood draining from my face. I was a ghost, a phantom, standing in a government office. "I am standing right here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I am obviously not dead." The woman gave me a look of genuine sympathy, a look that said she'd seen it all, but this was a new level of insanity. "I can see that, honey, I really can," she said softly. "But the system, it doesn't. You'll have to go to the county clerk's office, the vital records department, and file for a correction. It could take months. Months." I walked out of the DMV and into the blinding sunlight, my legs unsteady. I was legally dead. My money was inaccessible. My identity had been stolen and buried under a mountain of paperwork. They hadn't just disowned me. They had erased me. They had committed the perfect, bloodless murder. Back in my apartment, my hands shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. I remembered the second envelope, the one my grandfather had given me. "Don't open this unless they try to burn it all down." They hadn't just tried to burn it, they had tried to bury the ashes. I tore it open. Inside, alongside a stack of legal documents, was a small black USB flash drive. I jammed it into my laptop. There was only one file, a video. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as a winter sea. "Seraph," he said, his voice calm and steady, a voice that had once commanded fleets. "If you are watching this, it means Maximilian has done what I always feared he would. He will not just try to take your inheritance. He will try to take your very existence. Do not trust the system, my girl. They have bought it. Trust what I have left for you. The fight is yours now. So fight like a Volkov." The video ended. The screen went black. The room was silent, but a roar was building in my head. The roar in my head, the one ignited by my grandfather's video, was a controlled burn. I was a legal ghost, erased by a pen stroke, but I was still a naval officer. My training dictated a calm, strategic response. I would call Rhea. We would assemble the evidence. We would file the motions. We would fight this war in the sterile, logical arena of the law. I still believed, foolishly, that there were rules of engagement. That evening, I was sitting on my floor, surrounded by the documents my grandfather had left me, trying to piece together the legal puzzle, when I flicked on the television for some background noise, and then I saw him, my father, Maximilian Thorne. He was on Kusi News, the local San Diego station, seated across from a news anchor. He was wearing a deep navy suit, a somber tie, and an expression of carefully crafted paternal concern. This was his preferred battlefield, the court of public opinion, where truth was malleable and perception was everything. "Mr. Thorne," the anchor began, her voice smooth and serious, "there have been some unsettling rumors surrounding the estate of your late father-in-law, Admiral Volkov. Can you comment on the alleged family dispute?" Maximilian let out a long, practiced sigh, the kind a man performs when he is burdened by the unfortunate affairs of lesser people. "Thank you for asking, Brenda," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "First and foremost, our family loves my daughter, Serafina, very much. We are incredibly proud of her service to our country." He paused, letting the patriotic sentiment hang in the air. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. This was a calculated move. "However," he continued, his tone shifting to one of deep, sorrowful gravity, "it's no secret that the things our brave men and women experience overseas can leave scars, deep ones. Serafina has been struggling since her return. She's not always herself." He leaned forward, his face a mask of feigned anguish. "This isn't about money. This has never been about money. this is about protecting a vulnerable member of our family and ensuring the stability of a legacy she is not currently in a position to manage. We are simply trying to do what is best for her, even if she can't see it right now. He dared. The air in my apartment turned to ice. The controlled burn inside my head erupted into a full-blown inferno. He dared to stand on a public stage, wrapped in a flag of false patriotism, and use my service, my sacrifice, my honor, the very core of my identity, as a weapon against me. He wasn't just disowning me. He wasn't just erasing me. He was pathologizing me. He was taking my greatest source of pride and twisting it into a diagnosis of mental instability. He was weaponizing the very real struggles of countless veterans to serve his own greedy, despicable ends. The stereotype of the damaged veteran, a trope he and his corporate friends profited from, but privately disdained, was now his shield and his sword. Every ounce of restraint, every lesson in disciplined calm evaporated. The pain of the burned check, the shock of the legal death, it all paled in comparison to this. This was the ultimate betrayal. This was a character assassination of the highest order. The fury that rose in me was no longer hot. It was a blade of ice, sharp and absolute. The sadness of a daughter who had lost her family was gone, replaced by the cold, clear rage of a naval officer whose honor had been publicly debased. I looked at the flickering image of my father's face on the screen, his well-rehearsed sorrow, and I no longer saw a parent. I saw the enemy, clearly defined, unmistakable. The objective was now crystal clear. I stood up, my movements stiff and robotic. I walked across the room to the small mahogany box my grandfather had given me years ago, the one where I kept my most sacred possessions, my commission certificate, my service medals, and nestled in a bed of worn velvet, the old brass naval compass he'd given me on the porch of his house that night. I picked it up. It felt cool and solid in my trembling hand. I watched the needle, steady and unwavering, as it pointed true north. Always true north. My mind flashed to an image of another warrior, a woman who fought her battles, not on the sea, but in the highest court of the land, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. A woman of small stature and immense, unyielding strength. I remembered a quote of hers Rhea had once framed in her office. "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." My fight was no longer just about a will or a company. It was for my name. It was for my grandfather's honor. It was for every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who had ever been dismissed or pitied by men like Maximilian Thorne. I set the compass down. I picked up my phone. My fingers, which had been shaking moments before, were now perfectly steady. I scrolled to Rhea's number. The time for strategy, for quiet preparation, was over. They had brought the war to me, into the public square. They had fired the first shot in a new, dirtier campaign. If you have ever been pushed to the brink, ever had your own truth twisted and used against you by the very people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever reached that moment where silence is no longer an option, I want you to leave a comment. Just one single word, enough. Let me know that I am not alone in this fight. And hit that subscribe button, because from this moment on, we are no longer on the defensive. We are about to launch a full-scale counterattack. I pressed the call button. Rhea answered on the first ring. "Rhea," I said, my voice as calm and cold as the deep ocean. "They've declared war. It's time we returned fire, full force." My phone call to Rhea was not a plea for help. It was a deployment order. The time for grieving was over. The time for righteous anger had passed. Now it was time for cold, hard, tactical execution. The next morning, Ria's cluttered office in Liberty Station transformed. The comforting chaos of a neighborhood law practice gave way to the focused intensity of a forward command post. She had cleared off a large conference table and erected a whiteboard, which was soon covered in a spiderweb of timelines, names, and corporate entities connected by angry red lines. The air was thick with the smell of day-old coffee and a palpable sense of purpose. Any personal feelings I had, the hurt, the betrayal, were locked away. I was no longer a daughter. I was a commanding officer, and this was my war room. Ria had made one call. To Kalen Cale Bishop. He arrived an hour later, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 30s who looked more like a university librarian than a former naval intelligence officer. He carried a heavy-duty Pelican case, which he opened with practiced efficiency, revealing an array of sophisticated forensic equipment. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, just a firm handshake and a quiet, "Commander." His focus was absolute. I laid out the documents my grandfather had left in the second envelope, the forged stock transfer agreements bearing a crude version of my signature. I also provided a stack of my official military service records, documents filled with my authentic signature, signed over years of service. Kalen went to work. The only sounds in the room were the soft whir of his scanner, the rhythmic click of his keyboard, and the occasional slurp of coffee. Ria and I sat opposite him, mainlining the potent brew and dissecting the legal vulnerabilities of Maximilian's empire. We traced shell corporations, analyzed tax filings, and cross-referenced board meeting minutes. Every personal emotion was compartmentalized, replaced by the cold, clear logic of legal strategy. This was familiar territory for me, a process of assembling facts to build an unshakable case. The only difference was that this time the target wasn't a corrupt contractor or a rogue officer. It was my own family. After 2 hours of intense, silent work, Cale leaned back from his laptop. "I've got it," he said, his voice flat and devoid of drama. He turned his monitor towards us. On the screen were 2 images, side by side. "This," he said, pointing to the left, "is your authentic signature, Lieutenant Commander. I've analyzed 24 examples. Notice the distinct loop in the capital V of Volkov and the slight upward flourish at the end of the V. It's a consistent, unconscious habit." He then pointed to the signature on the stock transfer document. "And this is the forgery. The loop in the V is closed, the final stroke is flat, and terminates abruptly. More importantly," he continued, zooming in on the image, "the pixel analysis shows digital artifacting around the edges. This isn't a fresh signature, it's a low-resolution digital lift, a copy-paste job. My guess is they scanned it from your DD-214, your discharge papers, which are semi-public records. It's sloppy work, amateurish." He looked at me, his expression unchanged. "I can write a sworn affidavit on this analysis. No credible expert in the country could refute it." Ria let out a low whistle. The silver bullet. The injustice was no longer just a feeling in my gut. It was a verifiable fact, a piece of evidence we could present to a judge. A round was now chambered, ready to be fired. Ria looked at me, her expression serious. "The legal evidence is solid, Serafina. We can file for an emergency injunction. But Maximilian will fight back with everything he has. He'll use his army of lawyers to bury us in motions, to delay for months, even years. All while his PR machine continues to paint you as unstable on the nightly news. We need to control the narrative. We need a preemptive strike." I knew she was right. My father's power wasn't just in his bank account. It was in his influence, his ability to shape public perception. We couldn't just win in the courtroom, we had to win in the open, where his lies would wither under the harsh light of public scrutiny. My mind immediately went to one name, Declan Riker. He was an old-school investigative journalist, a dying breed. He had a reputation for being relentless and incorruptible, the man who had exposed a massive bribery scandal involving a defense contractor and a powerful California congressman, a scandal that had ended with the congressman's resignation. Riker didn't bow to power, he dismantled it. I found his number through an old contact. I took a deep breath, my strategic mind taking over, and dialed. He answered on the second ring, his voice a gruff, "Riker." "Mr. Riker," I said, my own voice steady and clear. "This is Lieutenant Commander Serafina Volkov. I have a story for you. A story about Aegis Dynamics, a burned inheritance, a fraudulent death certificate, and a truth they are desperately trying to bury." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his investigative mind. Then, finally, his gruff voice came back, no longer just questioning, but filled with a spark of interest. "Where do we meet?" The meeting with Declan Riker was brief and to the point. I met him in a dive bar near the waterfront, a place that smelled of stale beer and secrets. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights and hard stories. I didn't give him theories or feelings. I gave him facts. I handed him a flash drive containing Kale's forensic analysis, the sworn affidavit from the coerced doctor, and copies of the fraudulent legal filings. He looked at the evidence, then at me, his journalist's eyes assessing my credibility. "They really declared you dead?" he asked, a note of grim fascination in his voice. "Legally," I confirmed. He just nodded. "I'll be in touch." The preemptive strike was launched at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. Declan Riker's story wasn't buried on page 12. It was the lead feature on ProPublica, the nonprofit investigative journalism powerhouse. The headline was a cannon shot, a legacy in ashes, an identity erased inside the Thorne family's battle for control of defense giant Aegis Dynamics. The story was a masterclass in journalistic demolition. It laid out everything in cold, hard, undeniable detail. The burned check, the faked death certificate, the forged signatures on the stock transfers, and my father's self-serving television interview. Riker had even found 2 former Aegis employees who, under the cloak of anonymity, confirmed Maximilian's volatile temper and his long-standing disdain for my military career. The story didn't just make waves, it triggered a tsunami. It was picked up by the Associated Press, Reuters, and every major news network before the sun had fully risen over San Diego. It tore through social media, with the hashtag #JagaJusticeForVolkov trending nationwide. The veterans community, a powerful and vocal network, was incandescent with rage. The Aegis Dynamics stock price didn't just dip, it plummeted the moment the New York Stock Exchange opened. My father's meticulously crafted world of power and control had just imploded. They were no longer in control of the narrative. They were the narrative. And I knew, with the certainty of a commander whose strategy was unfolding perfectly, that they were now reacting, not acting. And panicked men make mistakes. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for that same afternoon. I walked into the San Diego Superior Courthouse, the clicking of my dress shoes on the marble floor the only sound I allowed myself to make. My white uniform was no longer a symbol of defiance. It was a symbol of order and truth in a room about to be consumed by chaos. Maximilian and Isolde were already there, huddled with a team of 3 high-priced corporate lawyers. Their faces were ashen. The confident arrogance was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive fury. My father's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. Isolde shrank in her seat, avoiding my gaze, her designer suit looking like ill-fitting armor. Their lead attorney, a slick man named Benson, stood up and immediately went on the offensive, trying to dismiss Riker's article as tabloid sensationalism and an unfortunate airing of private family matters. But Rhea was ready. She rose to her feet, a predator sensing weakness. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and ringing with authority. "This is not a private family matter. This is a matter of felony fraud, forgery, and a conspiracy to illegally seize control of a multi-billion-dollar corporation." Benson scoffed. "Allegations, Ms. Caldwell. Nothing but baseless allegations from a disgruntled daughter." "Is it an allegation, Mr. Benson?" Rhea retorted, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "When we have a sworn affidavit from a board-certified forensic document analyst?" She placed Cale's detailed report on the judge's bench. "Is it an allegation when we have a videotaped deposition from the very doctor who was deceived into signing a fraudulent medical report?" She placed a second file next to the first. "And is it an allegation, Your Honor," she said, turning to face the packed courtroom, "when we have the victim, a decorated officer of the United States Navy, standing right here, very much alive?" The room was electric. Benson was sputtering, his arguments collapsing under the weight of the evidence. But Rhea wasn't finished. She had one more weapon to deploy. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to present one final piece of testimony, a video statement recorded by Admiral Augustus Volkov 1 month before his death." The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Kinley, nodded. Permission granted. The courtroom lights dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. And then he was there, my grandfather. He looked frail, but his eyes were filled with an unshakable resolve. He looked directly into the camera, as if he were looking right at me, right at the judge, right at my father. "If you are watching this," his calm, authoritative voice filled the silent room, "it means that my son-in-law, Maximilian Thorne, has attempted to dishonor my final wishes and disenfranchise my granddaughter. Let me be unequivocally clear. I have watched him build an empire on greed, and I have watched my granddaughter build a life on honor. The choice was never in doubt." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "My legacy is not just about money or a company. It is about integrity. And I am entrusting that legacy to the only person in this family who truly understands its meaning. My granddaughter, my fellow warrior, Lieutenant Commander Serafina Volkov. This was my decision, made of my own free will in sound mind and body. Any document, any claim, any action that contradicts this final testament is a fraud and a lie." The video ended, plunging the room back into a profound silence. Every eye was on Maximilian. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked broken, defeated, a king dethroned not by a rival army, but by the simple, unassailable truth spoken by a dead man. Judge Kinley stared down from the bench, her expression like granite. She looked directly at my father. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice cold and sharp as a razor, "this court finds sufficient and credible evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and perjury." She shifted her gaze to a stunned Isolde. "And you, Ms. Thorne, as a willing accomplice." The gavel came down. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a final fatal gunshot. All asset transfers and corporate actions executed under the fraudulent authority are hereby declared null and void and are frozen pending further investigation. The estate of Admiral Volkov is to be executed as written, with Lieutenant Commander Volkov as the sole heir and controlling party of Aegis Dynamics. This matter is now referred to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation. Checkmate. The war was over. I had won. The victory in the courtroom was absolute. But it didn't feel like a celebration. There was a sense of profound release, yes, but it was followed by the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes after a long and brutal campaign. The war was over, but now came the aftershocks, the quiet, personal reckoning. A week after the verdict, I received a text from Isolde. Just 3 words, "Please, let's talk." I remembered Ria's advice to me the day after we won. We were in her office, and she had said, "You won the war, Serafina. Now you have to decide who gets to live in your peacetime." I agreed to meet her. Not at the mansion in Coronado, not at the Aegis headquarters, but on neutral ground. A small, independent coffee shop in the historic Gaslamp Quarter, a place filled with the ghosts of a different San Diego. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table by the window. She looked diminished. Her expensive Chanel suit seemed to hang off her frame, and the flawless makeup couldn't hide the dark, sleepless circles under her eyes. The unshakable confidence, the air of entitled superiority was gone. In its place was a brittle, desperate fragility. "Seraph," she began, her voice trembling slightly as I sat down. "I'm so sorry." She reached across the table, her perfectly manicured hand hovering, wanting to touch mine. I didn't pull away aggressively. I simply let my hand rest in my lap, creating an invisible but impassable boundary. "I truly didn't know how far it would go," she stammered. "Dad, he said it was just legal paperwork, a strategy to protect the assets during a restructure. I just signed where he told me to." Her excuses were so weak, so transparent, they were almost insulting. The lies of a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar. I had seen her signature on the fraudulent transfer documents. I had seen her silent complicity in the lawyer's office as my inheritance was set on fire. I had seen her stand by my father's side as he built his web of deceit. I let her words hang in the air for a long moment, the silence broken only by the hiss of the espresso machine. "You signed my name to transfer my shares, Isolde," I said, my voice not angry, but flat and calm. It was the voice I used when cross-examining a witness I knew was lying. "You watched Dad burn that check. You said nothing when he went on television and publicly humiliated me, suggesting I was mentally unstable. That isn't not knowing. That's a choice. You made a choice." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through her foundation. "But I'm your sister. We're family," she choked out, the words a last desperate appeal to a bond she herself had helped to sever. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a profound and weary sadness. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of reality. "Family doesn't do what you did, Isolde," I said, my voice still quiet. "Family doesn't try to have one of their own declared legally dead. Family doesn't try to erase someone's existence for financial gain." I leaned forward slightly. "You had a choice to make, between doing what was right and doing what Dad wanted. Between your sister and your ambition, you chose your side. You chose power and you chose money. And in a way, I respect that clarity. But now," I said, my gaze unwavering, "you have to live with it." I stood up, pulling a $20 bill from my wallet. and placing it on the table to cover our coffees. The finality of the gesture seemed to register with her. Her face crumpled. "Please, Seraph, don't do this." I looked down at her one last time. "I'm not going to press for criminal charges against you," I said. And this was my final act of grace, a mercy she didn't deserve, but that I needed to give for myself. I don't want to become like him, consumed by the need to destroy. But you are no longer a part of my life. There is no Aegis for you. There is no Volkov Foundation. There is nothing. Goodbye, Isolde. I turned and walked away without looking back. I could hear a choked sob behind me, the sound of a bridge collapsing into the abyss. But I kept walking. It hurt. It was a clean surgical pain, like an amputation necessary to save a life, my life. I was stepping out of their long, dark shadow and into the light, alone, but finally, truly free. In the aftermath of the storm, a quiet dawn began to break. The first thing I did with my reclaimed power was not to sit in my father's chair. The leather CEO throne at Aegis Dynamics held no appeal for me. It was a seat built on a foundation of ruthless ambition, a world I had long since left behind. Instead, I exercised my controlling shares to do what my grandfather could not. I cleaned house. I installed a new board of directors, people of integrity, including retired military officers and ethical business leaders, who understood that profit and principle were not mutually exclusive. Then I forged a new legacy. I took a significant portion of the company's profits and established the Volkov Foundation, Honor, Service, Future. Its headquarters were not in a corporate skyscraper, but in a restored brick building at Liberty Station, the very place where my own fight for justice had been planned. We transformed the old naval building into a state-of-the-art support center for female veterans, a sanctuary for women who, like me, had served their country, only to find themselves fighting new battles back home. We offered free legal counsel from Ria's firm, career transition workshops, housing assistance, and mental health resources. I wasn't just building a nonprofit, I was building the safety net that I never had. I was building a home for warriors. My grandfather often quoted the Bible to me, and one verse in particular echoed in my mind during those first few months of building. "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." My mercy was not for my father or my sister, it was for myself. It was the mercy of choosing to build, rather than to destroy, to heal rather than to inflict more pain. That, I realized, was the final act of defiance against their world. One afternoon, a young woman walked into the Foundation's office. She was hesitant, her shoulders slumped with a familiar weight. She was a former Marine corporal, I learned, who had been given a less than honorable discharge. After she reported a superior officer for harassment, the system designed to protect her had instead turned on her, labeling her a troublemaker and pushing her out. She sat across from my desk, her story tumbling out in a quiet, pained voice, her eyes filled with a desperate, hopeless exhaustion I knew all too well. I didn't make any grand promises. I simply listened. When she was finished, I looked at her, not as a client, but as a sister in arms. "You are not alone anymore," I told her, my voice gentle but firm. "We will fight with you." That day, Ria took on her case, pro bono. Kale offered his forensic skills to analyze digital evidence. We gave her a second chance, a team to stand in her corner. And as I watched her walk out of the office, her shoulders just a little straighter, her eyes holding a flicker of renewed hope, I finally understood what my grandfather's true legacy was. It wasn't the $38 million. It wasn't the controlling shares of a corporation. It was this one moment, this single life given a chance to be whole again. A few months later, on what would have been my grandfather's birthday, I drove my old Jeep out to Coronado Beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The Grand Thorn Mansion stood on the shoreline nearby, a silent, opulent monument to a life I no longer wanted. I didn't look at it. My gaze was fixed on the vast, open horizon of the Pacific Ocean. I pulled the old brass compass from my pocket. I didn't need it to find my way anymore, but I held it as a reminder of the man who had taught me what true north really was. The salty ocean breeze whipped through my hair, carrying with it a profound sense of peace. The war was over. The scars remained, etched into my memory, but they no longer ached. They were a map of where I had been, a testament to the strength I had found. I was not the product of their coldness. I was the legacy of my grandfather's love, forged in their fire and rebuilt from the ashes. My story, the battle for my name, is over. But I know for many of you, your own battles are still being fought every day. My grandfather taught me that honor is a legacy you build. If this story has reminded you of your own strength, of your own unshakable true north, then my story has found its true purpose. Thank you for listening. If you believe in the power of building a new legacy from the ashes of the past, please subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. You are not alone.